Rain tapped soft against the coffee shop windows, the kind of steady rhythm that makes you linger. I was buried in my notebook, half thinking, half hiding, when she walked in. Not just anyone, she had that way of moving like she already belonged in the room. She ordered a black coffee, glanced around, and when her eyes found me, she didn't just look, she searched. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, sliding into the seat before I could answer. She introduced herself, a journalist working on a feature about unconventional love stories. Her smile was quick, disarming. Her voice carried a kind of warmth that made you want to hand over the parts of yourself you usually keep hidden. At first, her questions were harmless. Where I grew up. What I did for a living. Then they began to curve, almost accidentally, toward the kind of truths you don't give strangers: first loves, heartbreaks, the moment I realized my life would never follow the script my family expected. I told her more than I should have, and she listened like every word mattered. By the time my coffee was cold, she leaned in just enough for me to notice, and said quietly, "I think there's more to you than you'd let me print." The way she smiled when she said it made me wonder if she was talking about the story, or about herself. The rain had been falling since morning, a slow, patient drizzle that blurred the city outside into shades of gray. Inside the coffee shop, the air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that makes people forget the time. I had been sitting in the corner for hours, notebook open, pen idle in my hand, pretending to work but really just letting my thoughts drift. The place was half empty, save for the quiet hum of the espresso machine and the occasional sound of cups being stacked behind the counter. I liked it this way: low noise, no interruptions, no one asking questions I didn't feel like answering. Then she walked in. I didn't notice her at first. My eyes were still tracing the same sentence I'd written twice over, trying to make sense of the words, when a small shift in the room's energy pulled my attention. She had just stepped through the door, shaking the rain from her coat. She wasn't the kind of beautiful that makes you look twice out of obligation, she was the kind that makes you look twice because something in you needs to. Her presence was quiet but sure, like she knew exactly where she belonged. She moved toward the counter with a measured grace, ordered a black coffee in a low, confident tone, and then turned as if scanning the room for someone. Her eyes landed on me. And in that moment, it didn't feel like she was simply looking. It felt like she was searching, and somehow, she had found exactly what she'd been looking for. She walked over without hesitation, her boots making soft sounds against the wood floor. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, already sliding into the seat across from me. It wasn't really a question. I closed my notebook halfway, unsure whether to be irritated at the intrusion or curious about it. She introduced herself as a journalist, working on a feature about unconventional love stories for a lifestyle magazine. Her smile was quick and unguarded, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she was comfortable in other people's spaces. She didn't pull out a recorder right away, just sat there with her coffee cupped in her hands, steam curling up toward her face. At first, her questions were light. Where I grew up. What I did for work. How I ended up in this part of the city. Her voice was warm and smooth, each question sounding less like an interview and more like the start of a secret being shared. I answered politely, giving her the sort of safe details I'd given 100 strangers before. But as the minutes passed, her questions shifted. Almost without warning, they began to slip under my guard. She asked about my first real love, not the name, but the feeling of it, the way it changed me. She asked if I'd ever been heartbroken in a way that left me different forever. She asked about the moment I knew I was drawn to women, and what that moment had cost me. I found myself telling her things I usually saved for people who had earned my trust over years. Yet here I was, speaking softly, watching the way she leaned in, the way her eyes didn't flick away when I said something raw or uncomfortable. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the silences. She just listened, as though every word I gave her mattered enough to hold on to. At one point, I noticed her smile, not the polite one she'd worn when she sat down, but something smaller, more private, almost like she was seeing through me in a way I wasn't sure I minded. I caught myself wondering if she was this way with everyone she interviewed, or if something about me had made her stay longer than she planned. By the time my coffee had gone cold and the light outside had dimmed to a late afternoon haze, I felt a strange mix of unease and connection. She set her empty cup down, leaned forward just enough that I caught the faint scent of rain still clinging to her, and said in a quiet voice, "I think there's more to you than you'd let me print." She didn't phrase it as a challenge, more like a promise. The curve of her lips when she smiled afterward felt like the opening of a door, and I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to walk through. But I knew, without a doubt, that she wanted me to. It was 3 days before I saw her again. I told myself I wasn't waiting, that I was too busy to think about her, but every time I passed that coffee shop window I caught myself glancing inside, as though she might still be there with that slight, knowing smile. When her message came, short, almost casual, it caught me off guard. She asked if I'd like to meet again, not for an interview this time, just coffee. I hesitated before answering, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew I did. When we met, it was at a different place, a small cafe tucked between 2 bookstores on a side street I rarely walked. She was already seated when I arrived, a faint smudge of ink on her hand from the notebook open in front of her. This time there was no recorder, no pretense of journalism. She greeted me with the kind of warmth that made it impossible to stay guarded. We ordered, and for a moment, the conversation circled around nothing important, the weather, the coffee, the way the city seemed quieter that day. But then, as if she couldn't help herself, she tilted her head slightly and said, "Tell me the unedited version." I asked her what she meant, though I already knew. "Last time," she said, her eyes holding mine, "I think you gave me the version that could survive on paper. I want the one you've never said out loud." I could have laughed it off, changed the subject, but something about the way she was looking at me made it impossible to retreat. So I began. I told her about the first girl I ever liked, how it had been both terrifying and thrilling. I told her about being 15 and hearing the word lesbian spat like an insult in the school hallway, how it stuck to me even before I claimed it for myself. I spoke of the first time I kissed another girl, the taste of mint gum and the way the world seemed to go silent except for the pounding of my own heart. And then I told her about the relationship that nearly broke me, not because of her, but because of the weight we carried. How we loved each other fiercely but quietly, always calculating who might see us, who might judge, who might decide our happiness was something they could destroy. I told her about the night we ended it, sitting in the car outside my apartment, both of us crying but neither of us asking the other to stay. While I spoke, she didn't look away. She didn't glance at her phone or fidget or try to fill the pauses. She listened like she had been waiting for these words, like she understood the shape of them before they even left my mouth. And in the moments when I faltered, unsure if I was saying too much, she gave a small nod, the kind that says I'm still here, keep going. I noticed the way her hands rested around her cup, fingertips brushing the ceramic like she was grounding herself in the moment. I noticed the faint line between her brows when I spoke of loss, the way it smoothed when I tried to lighten the weight of my words with a half smile. There was something magnetic in the way she absorbed what I was saying, as though she could feel it as I felt it. When I finally trailed off, uncertain of what she might think, she didn't rush to offer comfort or platitudes. Instead, she said quietly, "You make it sound like love is both the safest place and the most dangerous." I thought about that for a moment, realizing she was right. Then she told me her own version, how she grew up in a home where affection was rationed, where silence was the answer to questions about feelings. She told me about the girl she once loved from a distance, a secret she carried alone until it was too heavy. Her voice caught when she described how easy it was to lose yourself when the world told you not to be who you were. We sat there long after our coffee had cooled, the cafe around us fading into the background. There was no interview now, no audience to imagine. Just two people trading pieces of themselves across a small table, in a corner of the city no one else seemed to notice. And though we never touched, something between us had shifted again, settling into a space that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. When we finally left, walking in the same direction until the street split, she gave me a look before we parted, a look that felt like the continuation of a sentence I didn't yet know how to finish. We didn't plan our next meeting. It happened the way certain things seem meant to, by accident that doesn't feel like an accident at all. I was walking through the park late one afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy with the promise of rain but doesn't quite follow through, when I saw her sitting on a bench under the shade of an old elm tree. She had her notebook balanced on her knee, pen tapping idly as she stared out at nothing in particular. I almost kept walking, afraid to break whatever moment she was in, but she looked up at the exact second I hesitated. That small spark of recognition passed over her face, and then she smiled, soft, real, the kind that made it impossible to turn away. She closed her notebook as I approached, as if the words inside weren't meant for that moment, and made room beside her. We sat in the quiet, the park's usual sounds, the distant hum of traffic, a child's laughter, the low chatter of strangers, blurring into a kind of background music. She was the first to speak, asking about my day, but it wasn't the sort of small talk people make to fill silence. She wanted the real answer, and so I gave it to her. I told her I'd been writing, trying to work through a scene that wouldn't come together, and she laughed when I admitted I'd probably stared at a blank page for longer than I'd actually written. It felt easy to talk to her here, away from the formality of a coffee shop table, away from the invisible script of an interview. She told me she liked coming to this park when she needed to think, that it reminded her of being a teenager when she would sneak out to sit on the swings at night just to feel the air move around her. I asked her if she had always been like this, curious, direct, and she tilted her head, thinking. She said she used to be quiet, almost painfully so, until she realized silence was a kind of permission she didn't want to keep giving. That confession opened something between us. We began to trade stories, the kind you don't always tell in order, the kind that aren't rehearsed. She told me about her first crush, a teacher in her first year of high school, how she never acted on it but carried the secret like a small ember that both warmed and scared her. She told me about the time she almost came out to her parents but stopped herself when she saw the way they spoke about someone else's daughter who had. Her words carried the weight of someone who had been watching the world for a long time, collecting pieces of it in order to understand herself. I found myself telling her more than I intended to. I spoke about the nights I stayed up wondering if I'd ever be able to live openly without feeling the need to explain myself. I told her about the moments of pride that were followed too quickly by moments of doubt. And in between those heavier truths, we laughed, real, unguarded laughter that made people walking by glance at us like we were sharing a joke too good to miss. At one point, she shifted on the bench, her knee brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but it lingered. She didn't move away, and neither did I. Instead, the closeness became a quiet presence, like an unspoken acknowledgement of something neither of us had yet named. I noticed the way her eyes caught the fading light, how they softened when I looked at her. I noticed the curve of her mouth when she smiled, the slight crease in her cheek that deepened when she laughed. And I realized I was cataloging these things not because I wanted to remember her as a subject in a story, but because I wanted to remember her as she was, here, with me. The afternoon slipped toward evening without either of us checking the time. Eventually, we stood, and she suggested a small diner nearby for dinner. We sat in a booth near the back, the hum of the neon sign outside washing the table in a faint pink glow. Over plates of fries and coffee refills we didn't really need, she told me about the cities she'd visited, the people she'd met who had stayed with her in unexpected ways. I told her about the places I wanted to go but hadn't yet found the courage to visit. We didn't talk about what we were doing, about how this wasn't an interview anymore. We didn't need to. By the time we walked out into the cool night air, the space between us felt different. It wasn't just that we knew more about each other, it was that we had started to let each other in, piece by piece, like carefully placing stones across a river. Not quite at the other side yet, but close enough to see where the path might lead. It was one of those evenings when the city seemed to slow down, as though it had decided to take a breath. We had been talking for hours in a dim little cafe with mismatched chairs and an old jukebox that played songs no one had requested. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain, and the low murmur of conversation from other tables felt distant, like we were sitting in a bubble separate from everything else. Outside, the sky had been heavy all day, a restless gray that finally gave in, releasing a steady rain against the wide front windows. She sat across from me, her elbows resting on the table, hands curled around a mug that had long gone cold. There was a looseness to her posture, like she had nothing else she needed to be doing and no one else she needed to be with. Her hair fell in a way that made me think she'd given up trying to tame it after the first hour of the day, and there was something disarming about how completely present she was in that moment. I don't remember who suggested we leave, but I remember that neither of us wanted the evening to end. She pulled on her coat and glanced toward the window. "No umbrella?" she asked, already knowing the answer. When I shook my head, she grinned in a way that felt like an invitation. "Then let's just walk." The first few steps outside were a shock. The rain was colder than it looked, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that only comes after hours of waiting to fall. We moved side by side down the quiet street, our shoes splashing through shallow puddles that caught the glow of the streetlights. She tilted her head back once, letting the drops hit her face, her smile widening in that way she had when she wasn't thinking about it. Every few blocks we passed shop windows with their lights still on, the glass streaked with water, blurring the outlines of whatever was inside. We didn't talk much at first. The sound of the rain against the pavement and the occasional whoosh of a passing car filled the silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable quiet, it was the kind that wraps around you, the kind that feels shared. At a crosswalk where the signal light glowed red, she stopped walking. I turned toward her, and she was already looking at me, her eyes steady, unflinching. "I've never felt this drawn to someone so quickly," she said, her voice low but certain, like she wasn't testing the words but stating them as fact. I opened my mouth to respond, but all that came out was a half-formed laugh, an instinctive attempt to break the tension. She didn't look away. The rain was falling harder now, tapping against our shoulders, sliding down between our fingers. The space between us felt charged in a way that made me hyper-aware of every small detail, the dampness of my hair against my neck, the faint scent of her perfume mixed with rain, the sound of her breathing just a little faster than before. I didn't move closer, and neither did she, but it didn't matter. The moment was its own kind of closeness, a pause heavy with things we weren't ready to say out loud. The signal light changed, and we stepped forward together. We kept walking, weaving through streets that felt different in the rain, softer somehow. At one point she brushed her hand against mine, almost absent-mindedly, but her fingers lingered for just a second too long before pulling away. We found ourselves at a small park, the kind with a single bench under a tree that offered no real shelter. She sat down anyway, patting the space beside her. The rain was softer here, filtered through the leaves above, and for a while we just watched it fall. She asked me about the happiest moment I'd ever had, and I told her about a summer years ago when everything felt simple, when I'd believed love could exist without complication. She smiled at that, then told me about a night she'd spent on a rooftop in another city, watching the sunrise with someone she thought she'd love forever. We didn't dwell on the endings of those stories, only the way they had felt while they lasted. Eventually we stood again, walking back toward the part of the city where our paths would split. The rain had soaked through my coat, my hair was plastered to my forehead, and yet I didn't care. When we reached the corner where we'd have to part, she hesitated, like she was considering saying something more. But she didn't. She just gave me that same searching look she'd had the first time we met, the one that felt like it saw past every version of myself I'd learned to present. And then she smiled, small, almost secret, and turned away, leaving me standing there in the rain, feeling like something had shifted again, even if I couldn't name exactly what it was. The next time we met, the air between us felt different, heavier somehow, like we had both been carrying around something unsaid since that night in the rain. It wasn't awkward exactly, but there was a carefulness to our movements, a quiet measuring of words, as though each of us was waiting for the other to name whatever was building between us. We chose a small cafe tucked away from the busier streets, one with soft yellow light and the faint sound of an old record player spinning something slow in the background. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a half-finished cup of tea in front of her, her fingers tracing the rim in small, absent circles. When she looked up and saw me, her smile came slowly, almost like she wasn't sure how much of it to give. I slid into the seat across from her, the worn leather squeaking quietly, and for a few minutes we stayed with small talk, how our weeks had been, the weather, little things that didn't matter but kept the space between us easy. But then her eyes caught mine, and there was no avoiding it. She took a breath and leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her voice steady but softer than usual. She didn't dress it up as curiosity or journalistic interest. She didn't try to hide behind vague words. "I can't stop thinking about you. And honestly, it scares me a little." Her honesty sent a ripple through me. I felt it in my chest, in the way my fingers tightened around my coffee cup. I told her I felt the same, that it was strange how quickly she had gotten under my skin, how much space she took up in my thoughts. I admitted I wasn't sure what to do with it, because feelings like this had a history of coming with risk for me. She asked me what I meant, and I told her, not all at once, but in the way you pull back layers you've kept hidden for too long. I spoke about the times I'd been open about who I was and watched people I cared for pull away. I told her about the betrayal that had taught me to keep parts of myself locked away, about the friend who had turned into a stranger when she learned the truth, about the woman who had promised she wouldn't leave but did when things got hard. My voice wavered at times, not from sadness so much as from the effort of letting someone see this deeply. She didn't flinch. She listened with that same unwavering attention she had from the very beginning, her eyes steady, her expression shifting only in quiet, empathetic ways, her brow furrowing slightly at my pain, her lips parting as though she wanted to interrupt but knowing not to. When I finished, she rested her elbows on the table and leaned closer, closing the distance just enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. Then she began to tell me her own stories, about the girl she had loved and lost because she wasn't ready to be out, about the way she had once hidden whole pieces of herself just to keep the peace in her family, about how she had decided, somewhere along the way, that she'd rather be alone than be loved conditionally. Her voice caught when she said that, and I felt something inside me twist at the thought of her younger self making that kind of decision. We sat like that for a long time, leaning in over the table, speaking in low voices like the words weren't meant for anyone else to hear. The cafe was nearly empty by then, the record player still humming its slow, scratchy tunes. At some point, without thinking, my knee brushed against hers under the table. I should have pulled back, but I didn't. She didn't either. The contact was small, nothing anyone else would notice, but for me it was like a quiet agreement had passed between us, something unspoken but understood. We stayed like that, knees touching, our eyes locked in a way that felt both grounding and dangerous. Eventually she smiled, not the polite smile she had given me the first day we met, but something warmer, almost shy. I don't know what this is yet, she said, but I don't want to pretend it's nothing. I told her I didn't either, and for the first time since she'd sat down across from me that afternoon, I felt my chest loosen. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a step, and it was enough. When we finally stood to leave, the air outside was cold and sharp against my skin, but I felt warmer than I had in weeks. We walked together until our paths split, and when she said goodbye, she let her hand rest on my arm just a fraction longer than necessary. That touch stayed with me all the way home. The next time we saw each other, it wasn't planned. I had gone out late on a Wednesday night, walking aimlessly through the quiet streets just to clear my head. The day had been one of those that left me restless, unable to settle into anything. The city was in that strange in-between stage where most places were closed, but the streets weren't fully asleep. I was passing by a small bookstore that stayed open later than most when I spotted her inside, standing near the back wall with a book in her hand. Her head was tilted slightly as she read the back cover, her hair falling over her cheek. She looked so absorbed in that quiet moment that I almost didn't want to interrupt. But then she glanced up, and her eyes met mine through the glass. Her smile was instant, unguarded, and it pulled me inside without a second thought. The smell of old paper and ink wrapped around me as I stepped through the door. She put the book back on the shelf and walked over, her coat still draped over her arm like she'd just arrived too. "What are you doing here?" she asked, but there was no real curiosity in her tone, more like she was simply happy to have found me unexpectedly. I told her I'd been wandering, that the night felt too still to stay indoors. She said she'd been the same, only she'd been looking for a distraction. We ended up leaving together, and the moment the cold air hit us, she suggested we walk without any destination. The streets were almost empty, the lamplight spilling across wet pavement from an earlier rain. We walked side by side, our footsteps slow, the kind of pace you take when you're not in a hurry to arrive anywhere. Conversation came easily at first, light and wandering. We talked about the books we loved, the kind of music we listened to when we couldn't sleep, the cities we dreamed of visiting. But somewhere along the way, our words slowed, and the silence between us took on that familiar, charged quality. She glanced at me then, really looked, and it was like her gaze held something heavier than anything she'd said aloud. We turned down a narrow side street lit only by a few scattered lamps, and I felt her fingers brush mine. It was subtle at first, like she wasn't sure if she was imagining the closeness. Then her hand found mine fully, her fingers curling around with a deliberate gentleness that made my chest tighten. I didn't say anything. I just held on, letting the quiet stretch around us. It wasn't the first time our hands had touched, but this was different. This wasn't accidental contact under a cafe table, it was a choice, open and clear. The night air felt sharper, the sound of our footsteps softer. I could feel the warmth of her skin against mine, the slight squeeze of her fingers every now and then like she was checking if I was still there. At one point we stopped under a streetlight, and she didn't let go. Her eyes searched mine in that way she always did, as if she was looking for something she'd only recognize when she saw it. "I don't usually let people in this fast," she said, almost like it was a confession. I told her I didn't either, that maybe that was why this felt so different, because we were both breaking our own rules without quite meaning to. She smiled then, but it wasn't a light smile. It was slow, thoughtful, like she was filing the moment away. We kept walking, our joined hands swinging slightly between us. By the time we reached the river, the air had cooled even more, and our breaths came out in faint clouds. We leaned against the railing, looking out over the dark water, and she began telling me about a part of her life she said she didn't talk about much, her first real relationship, how it had started with the same kind of pull she felt now, and how it had ended with her questioning if she had imagined the whole connection. I listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of her words settle in the space between us. When she finished, she turned toward me fully. Her face was half in shadow, half lit by the street lamp, and for a moment I thought she might kiss me. But she didn't. Instead, she reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, her fingers brushing my cheek in a way that made the world feel unbearably still. "I'm trying to trust this," she said quietly, "even though it scares me." I wanted to tell her I felt the same, that the fear was part of what made this feel so alive, but the words caught in my throat. So instead, I squeezed her hand and stayed there beside her, watching the water carry the city lights away into the dark. When we finally began walking back, we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The weight of her hand in mine said more than anything either of us could have spoken. And by the time we reached the corner where we'd have to part, I knew something had shifted again, not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in that quiet, irreversible way where you realize you're already too far in to turn back. It had been a week since that night by the river, yet the memory of her hand in mine had stayed with me like a lingering warmth I couldn't shake. Every small thing seemed to pull me back to her, the way a certain song on the radio made me think of the slow rhythm of our footsteps, or how the smell of rain on concrete reminded me of that first evening we'd shared. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking everything or if she truly had been on my mind every waking moment. That afternoon, I was sitting in my apartment, sunlight pooling across the floor, when my phone lit up with her name. She asked if I was free, her message simple but carrying a weight I felt in my chest. I told her yes before I even thought about it. She suggested coming over, which she had never done before, and suddenly the air in my apartment felt charged. I found myself straightening up the cushions, making tea I wasn't sure we'd drink, and pacing just enough to make me realize I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. When she arrived, she was dressed casually, her hair pulled back, but there was something about her presence that filled the room instantly. She stepped inside and took a slow look around, her gaze moving from the bookshelves to the photos on the wall, like she was reading pieces of me I hadn't shown her yet. She didn't comment on anything, but her expression softened in a way that told me she noticed more than she let on. We ended up on the couch, the tea forgotten on the table between us. At first, it was easy, light conversation, gentle teasing, the kind of laughter that makes your shoulders loosen. But slowly, without either of us steering it, the space between us began to close. She shifted closer, her knee brushing mine, and I could feel the warmth radiating off her even in the quiet. There was no grand moment, no sudden rush. Instead, it was like gravity itself was pulling us toward each other. She asked me something then, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you ever feel like you're standing on the edge of something and you're not sure if you should step forward or turn back?" I looked at her and knew exactly what she meant, because I felt it too. That trembling space where desire and fear tangled so tightly you couldn't tell them apart. I told her I felt like that with her all the time, and her breath caught in a way that made my heart race. We sat there in silence for a moment, both of us caught in it, until she reached out and touched my face with the backs of her fingers, so softly it almost didn't feel real. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for a reason not to move closer, but when she didn't find one, her hand slid down to my jaw and stayed there. I could feel her pulse in her fingertips. I leaned into her touch, not thinking, just wanting to stay in that feeling a little longer. She whispered my name then, almost like she was testing the way it sounded in that closeness, and the sound of it in her voice made something inside me give way. Without realizing it, I'd leaned forward just enough that our foreheads touched. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, neither of us speaking, the weight of the moment settling around us. I could feel her breathing, steady but deep, and the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the warmth of her skin. Then she pulled back slightly, not away, just enough to look at me fully. Her eyes were so open it almost hurt to meet them. "I don't know what happens if I let this happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but I don't want to regret not finding out. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. I told her that maybe we didn't have to figure it all out right now, that maybe it was enough to just be here, to see where this pull between us wanted to take us. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting with a kind of relief, and then she leaned in until her lips brushed against my cheek, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a kiss exactly, not yet, but it sent a shiver through me that left me breathless. She stayed close after that, our hands finding each other on the couch cushion, fingers intertwining with an ease that felt both dangerous and safe all at once. We talked in low voices until the light outside shifted toward evening, the room growing softer and dimmer. She didn't rush to leave, and I didn't want her to. When she finally stood, there was a look in her eyes that made me think she was just as reluctant as I was to let the moment end. At the door, she hesitated for a heartbeat before leaning in and resting her forehead against mine one last time. "See you soon," she said, and her voice carried the weight of something unspoken. Long after she left, I sat in the quiet, the echo of her touch still warm against my skin, knowing we were standing closer than ever to the edge she had spoken about, and that I no longer cared about turning back. The day we finally crossed the line between what we had been and what we were becoming didn't arrive with any warning. It wasn't planned, wasn't dressed up with grand declarations or perfect timing. It was just a Thursday, cloudy and cool, the kind of day where the sky feels low and the air carries the smell of rain even before it starts. She texted me in the late afternoon, saying she was nearby and wanted to drop something off. There was no explanation, no hint in her words about what that something was, but my heart still began its restless pounding the moment I saw her name. When she arrived, she had a small paper bag in her hands, the handles twisted in her fingers. Inside was a book she said she had been meaning to give me since the night we met, the one she had been holding in that bookstore before we ever spoke. She told me it had sat on her desk for weeks, waiting for the right moment, and today felt like it. I turned it over in my hands, running my fingers along the cover, more touched than I could say. But there was something else in her eyes, something that made the air between us feel heavier. She didn't sit right away, just stood there like she was deciding something, and then finally set her coat down and came closer. We sat on the couch, the book between us like an unspoken tether. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty, it was thick, the kind that makes every small sound sharper. I could hear her breathing, the faint rustle of fabric when she shifted her weight toward me. She said my name in that low voice she only used when it was just us, and the sound of it pulled me in before I even realized I was leaning closer. Her hand found mine first, fingers threading through with a steady certainty that was different from the tentative brushes of the past. There was no hesitation this time, no checking if it was okay, just her hand holding mine like it had always belonged there. I could feel the warmth rising between us, the way our breaths began to match without meaning to. She looked at me then, her gaze lingering on my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "I'm tired of holding this back," she said, barely louder than the hum of the room. The truth was, I had been tired of it for a long time too, but hearing her say it made something shift inside me. I told her I didn't want to pretend anymore either, and as soon as the words left me, she leaned in, closing the last inch between us. The kiss was slow at first, almost cautious, like we were testing the weight of it, but the moment our lips met, all the weeks of restraint cracked open. Her hand moved to the side of my neck, fingers splaying gently against my skin, and I felt myself melt into the warmth of her. There was no rush, no urgency, just the deep, quiet knowing that this was what we had been moving toward all along. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads stayed pressed together, our breaths uneven. Neither of us spoke right away. There was nothing to say that could add to what had just happened. She smiled then, that small, soft smile that only belonged to her, and brushed her thumb over my cheek. We stayed like that for a long time, the world outside fading into a muted blur. Eventually, we curled into each other on the couch, the book forgotten on the table, and let the silence hold us. The rain started just before evening, tapping gently against the windows, and she reached for my hand again, lacing our fingers together as if to make sure I wouldn't drift away. In that moment, with the sound of the rain and the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me, I realized that whatever this was, whatever it would become, it had already changed us both. There was no going back to the safety of before. We had stepped off the edge together, and for the first time, neither of us was afraid of the fall. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more heartfelt LGBTQ love stories, and share it with someone who needs to feel the magic of connection today. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and every comment you leave is a spark that inspires the next one. Let's keep creating a world where love, in all its forms, is celebrated.